Many Christians believe that God's biblical feasts were abolished at the cross. They claim that the Apostle Paul kept the feasts merely as an opportunity to preach the gospel to the Jews. But what does the Bible actually say? Let's examine the scriptures and follow the life of Paul himself. Before we look at Paul's ministry, we must understand something important. God's appointed times did not originate with the nation of Israel. Their foundation was established at creation itself, Genesis 1:14. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years." The Hebrew word translated seasons is moed, meaning appointed times or appointments. It is the same word used in Leviticus 23 when God describes his appointed feasts. Notice that Genesis 1:14 does not use the Hebrew word onot, which refers to the four climate seasons such as summer, autumn, winter, and spring, but instead uses the word moed. Scripture points us to God's calendar and his appointed times from the very beginning. Now let's follow the Apostle Paul. Did Paul abandon the feasts after encountering Jesus? The evidence says otherwise. In Acts 18:21 we read, "I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem." These are Paul's own words. Notice the strength of his statement, "I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem." Paul did not speak as though the feasts had become meaningless. Instead, he expressed a strong desire to keep the feast. As his ministry continued, we see the same pattern. In Acts 20 verse 16, we read, "For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he would not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hurrying to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost." Why was Paul hurrying? Because he desired to be in Jerusalem for Pentecost. This was not a casual preference. The Bible specifically records that Paul arranged his travels around this feast. And notice another statement from Paul in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 8. "But I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost." Again, Paul measures his plans and travels in relation to God's appointed times. Some Christians argue that Paul only attended the feasts as a missionary strategy to reach Jews. But Paul's own testimony tells us otherwise. In Acts 24 verses 11 to 12, we read, "You may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city." Notice carefully what Paul said. He did not say that he went up to Jerusalem merely to evangelize. He said that he went up to Jerusalem to worship. Paul's purpose was worship. His own testimony removes the claim that his attendance at the feasts was only an evangelistic strategy. The evidence continues. Paul spent time with believers in Philippi, a city located in Greece. Concerning this period, we are told, "At Philippi, Paul tarried to keep the Passover." The Philippians were the most loving and true-hearted of the apostles' converts, and during the 8 days of the feast, he enjoyed peaceful and happy communion with them. Acts of the Apostles, page 390. We notice that Paul and the Philippian believers did not travel to Jerusalem to observe the feast. Instead, they kept it in Philippi, which is in Greece. This aligns with what Jesus told the Samaritan woman, that the time was coming when worship would no longer be centered in Jerusalem. Believers would not need to travel to Jerusalem to observe the appointed times, but would worship God in spirit and in truth wherever they were. John 4 verses 19 to 23. "The Samaritan woman said to him, 'Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship.' Jesus said to her, 'Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father.' You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. Even Luke records it this way. In Acts 26 it says, "We sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread." The Feast of Unleavened Bread remained significant enough that Luke specifically recorded it as part of the timeline of their journey. But the evidence goes even further. Paul did not merely keep the feasts himself, he encouraged believers to do the same. Writing to Gentile converts in Corinth, Paul declared, in 1 Corinthians 5 verses 7 to 8, "For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us, therefore let us keep the feast." Notice his words, "Therefore let us keep the feast." Paul did not say, "Let us abandon the feast." He did not say, "The feast no longer matters." Instead, he pointed believers to the Messiah-centered meaning of the feast. The Passover lamb pointed to Christ. The symbols found their fulfillment in him. Yet Paul still instructed believers regarding the feast and its spiritual significance. The New Testament contains clear evidence that believers continued observing God's appointed times without offering any animal sacrifices. As we step back and consider all the evidence, a clear picture emerges. Paul declared, "I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem." He was hurrying to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. He planned his travels around God's appointed times. He testified that he went to Jerusalem to worship. He remained in Philippi during the feast days and enjoyed keeping it with the Gentile converts. And he instructed believers, "Therefore let us keep the feast." The evidence is clear. Paul continued to observe God's appointed feasts after the death and resurrection of Messiah. Scripture records his desire to be in Jerusalem for the feast days to worship God in spirit and in truth. It shows him teaching believers the Christ-centered significance and purpose of these sacred times. Rather than abolishing the feasts, Paul's life and ministry demonstrate continued respect for God's appointed times as part of a faithful walk with God. The question is not whether Paul kept the feasts. The question is whether we are willing to follow the evidence of Scripture wherever it leads.